My background began in a very altruistic fashion. I was birthing babies in the Philippines when I decided to take a hard left turn in my career and move from engineering into medicine. In that journey, I got subspecialties in internal medicine and then subsequently endocrinology and metabolism, which is the study of the way in which the body communicates across complex organ systems to coordinate human life. And the word metabolism within that is understanding how we bring energy from the nature around us within us into a form that is usable for our constant regenerative effort towards health. In that field of endocrinology and metabolism, it became an opportunity for me to study cancer, which is the penultimate example of the failure of our connection of communication and energy liberation through metabolism. And so in studying the final endpoint of the dysfunction of these systems, I began a journey back up the river towards the root cause of where these cancer epidemics and epidemics of chronic disease throughout so many of our organ systems has emerged over the last few decades. And in that journey up that stream, I found my way to food and its relationship to soil and its relationship to the extraordinary elements of nature that has allowed us to emerge as a species. The life within the human is hardly human. In the end, we are an extraordinary distillation of the intelligence of a vast ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and beyond that live in the soils and the air around us and also live within our gut, within these thriving soils within us. 10 years ago, my basic science laboratory made some breakthroughs in understanding how chemical agriculture and our use of herbicides like glyphosate or Roundup were a pinnacle moment in our march towards the collapse of not just human health, but planetary health. We are now speeding towards the sixth extinction, and it comes down to this fundamental mistake we made of believing that the bacteria and fungi were against us, that the weeds were against us, that in fact nature was against us, and it was human versus the world if we were to survive. In that isolationist mindset, we engineered ourselves out of the nature that nurtured life to the point that it would sustain humanity. And so my journey has largely been my own discovery that I am a divine being, loved by a nature that I had separated myself from in my journey into a technological world that had believed the world to be my enemy rather than my source. And so my source journey, I believe, is the source journey of humanity. We took a hard turn away from nature, and it is our option now to either march into our extinction or take that right hand back into a nurturing flow state with nature and find ourselves in a new state of health and vitality. It is with some sort of irony that I feel that my career has led me into the microbiome, because when I first set out with the idea of being a doctor, I certainly had the human body as my holy grail of understanding, and set out in 17 years of academia to study into near oblivion the biology and systems of the body. In that time, I got to understand the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system and the incredible neurologic system of the brain and peripheral nervous systems. I got to understand the immune system. I got to understand the endocrine system, this extraordinary symphony and orchestra of hormones that keeps everything tuned and functioning together. And I thought I was really at the epicenter. I thought I was at ground zero of health and disease when I had found that endocrine system. If I could figure out how things could talk, I could figure out the language of health. And I was so excited by my endocrine fellowship, 3 years of extraordinary study, not just in the human systems, but also of the diseases that crop up in us. And this ultimately took me to the field of cancer. And studying cancer, I got into the understanding of how isolation and the loss of connectivity around a human cell is really the function or the ground zero, if you will, of disease as we understand it. And so cancer, being perhaps the penultimate disease of the human body, is an example of isolation at that cellular level. A cell disconnected from its environment becomes cancerous. As I've continued in my journey here of understanding communication and its role in cellular vitality and the breakdown of that vitality into disease, it has found me into this field of the microbiome. And it is so ironic, this last decade of science that has emerged. Now, hundreds of thousands of peer-reviewed science articles all over the world from nearly every single mindset and laboratory in the world, somehow tapping back into this information on the microbiome. It's a humbling thing as a scientist and a human doctor to understand that we are not a species that sits at some sort of penultimate, pyramid of life. We are absolutely on the daily basis, on the minute to minute, on the micron to micron scale, dependent upon and the result of this vast ecosystem of the microbiome. It cannot be overstated how vital the small and beautiful organisms within you are when it comes to human vitality. When you start to look at a garden, you start to get a glimpse of this system. And so I'm going to try to naturalize this description of this near cosmic scale of microbiome down to your daily experience. And I'm hoping that you've had some exposure to a garden, but if not, I would welcome you to think about a park or some other ecosystem in which you've spent time. When we disrupt nature, we typically do it by trying to reduce complexity. The human brain, in its limitations of the five senses, tries to be reductionist in its effort towards finding patterns. And so for this logical and perhaps necessary approach to understanding the world around us, we often lose sight of, or perhaps never see, the complex relationships between the systems that we can see. The microbiome is this secret between the things we see. What makes a tree thrive in a forest is not its root system. It's the relationship between that root system and the soil microbes and the nutrients within those soil systems and the trees nearby and the animals that would pass through that forest, leaving behind their genetics and their nutrient delivery. That cycle of life is so vastly beyond that root ball of the tree that would determine its vitality and its capacity to grow to its full potential. And so as we start to look at the human and a daily pattern of lifestyle that we see in the Western civilization world, we realize that we have not only forgotten about the importance of and vitality of the ecosystems outside of the root systems, we've perhaps completely cut off our roots. We are no longer touching the earth from which we would thrive, from which we actually emerged. We are barely touching nature anymore. Our shoes, the gloves we wear when we garden, the masks we wear when we are out and about, the air conditioning systems that separate us from the air that we would breathe, the cardboard box that we would call drywall and a modern house. All of these technological breakthroughs that have driven us towards comfort have ultimately isolated us away from a nature of diversity. In our monotony of biology, we find monotony of behavior at the biologic level. And monotony leads to ultimately decay. Without the exercise of biodiversity, without the exercise of new information, we start to reduce our vitality for life. This happens certainly at the cellular level. The microbiome, represented by the march of complexity in these single-celled organisms, could be mapped back to the archaea. The archaea were these extremely tough bacteria that could thrive in nearly every single imagined toxicity. Acid pools, volcanic events, oceans that had not yet balanced their pH and were acidic. The microbes started to develop in this system an incredible capacity for resilience. And those archaea would begin to move through the Earth's ecosystems, and each archaea would start to find niches in their capacity that were created perhaps by their environmental distinction. They may have floated into one corner of the pool that had some sort of advantageous pH or nutrient load that allowed that bacteria to thrive. Or it was the stress of its environment that led to a change in its genetic sequencing, a misspelling in its genetics that led to new potential. And it's in this misspelling or changing of the genetics that we started to see diversification emerge. The archaea and the early bacteria that would emerge from those archaea were masters of sharing information. The way in which this occurs is through something called horizontal gene transfer. The horizontal gene transfer occurs when one archaea would bump into another one and it would swap information. I'm making this gene today. I misspelled this gene and I have a new potential function within this gene that I just expressed because the stress in this environment led to this adaptation. When a gene would be transferred that was advantageous for survival in that pool of acid or whatever the environment, it could be replicated within that next archaea, and it would bump into another and it would share. And pretty soon the entire pool had a new trait, a new capacity for resilience that would be shared widely. This horizontal gene transfer continues 4 billion years later to today's complexity of a human ICU. We do this in all environments, but the ICU is really indicative of this phenomenon of horizontal gene transfer. An ICU, much like a modern chemical farm, is highly dependent on antibiotics to create monotonous outcomes. Sterilize the human body so the human body survives. That used to be our whole idea of the immune system. We now find out that by sterilizing the human body, we lose the soil, we lose vitality. But suffice it to say that this constant antibiotic pressure in a field with its herbicides or in an ICU with its antibiotics, we see this constant destruction of bacteria. And when you put that bacterial species or that population under stress, it again starts to accelerate its adaptation, and it will find a path around that antibiotic. And we call this drug-resistant microbes, where the bacteria suddenly becomes resistant to vancomycin or one of the other common antibiotics that we would use in the ICU. Or in the field, a weed would become tolerant to Roundup, the weed killer that we've been pouring on year after year into that soil system. This adaptation of resistance to chemical insult is done by horizontal gene transfer. One bacteria finds a pathway, a new enzyme pathway or a new genetic possibility of avoiding the toxin or the poison of the antibiotic, and it passes that information quickly to the bacteria that it bumps into. This phenomenon of horizontal gene transfer leads to this extraordinary experience that we have in ICUs today of rampant exposure to multi-drug resistant bacterium. We have such a problem with this in many hospitals where they're starting to lose Medicare funding for this hospital-acquired infections that are resistant to bacteria and can be extremely deadly as well as expensive to manage in these ICU settings. And so we have this economic pressure now to deal with these superbugs, as they're called. And the fact that they became superbugs is exemplary of this 4 billion year old trait of horizontal gene transfer, the movement of information between species and between the microbiome itself. For all the horizontal gene transfer that we experienced in that first billion and a half years of the march from archaea into more and more complex bacterium, we see the emergence of the ability to speak genetically over greater distances. Horizontal gene transfer required physical contact of one bacteria to the next. But some billion years into this march of archaea into bacteria, we start to see life emerge in more complexity. And it seemed to correlate with the advent of the virome. The virome is a description of the entire genetic database that would be held in the viruses globally. Viruses are not living organisms. They are not part of the microbiome. Instead, they are the genetic communication network of all cellular life on Earth, which of course began with the bacteria. When we started to see genetic potential travel over great distances, there was this great acceleration of biodiversification and therefore adaptation on the planet. And so around 1 billion to 1.5 billion years into the march of life, we see the emergence of the fungi. And the fungi were still single-celled organisms, but they had learned to act as a multicellular structure with specialization occurring. And so a mycelial root system could then specialize into a fruiting body and become a mushroom. While that fungi remains this single-celled organism building these multicellular systems, the hyphae of the root system of the mycelium and the like, we started to see this cooperative coordination of communication allowing for specialization of elements within these multicellular systems. With that, we saw an increased ability to sequester nutrients out of the soil and out of the other ecosystems of the world, water systems, the air, etc. And for that sequestration of nutrients being more effective, we got to see more complexity of biology emerge. And with that, some billion years later after the fungi, we start to see the emergence of the protozoa and ultimately the parasites. And so over some 3 billion year history, we go from archaea, to the more diverse bacterial species, to the fungi, to the protozoa, and ultimately into the parasite, which would have been the first real system of multicellular differentiation. Following the parasite, we got to see the emergence of things like the nematode and worms and the like, and then more complexity, we got into reptiles, from the reptiles to the birds, the mammals. We've seen this march of life happen, and at each iteration it got more complex in its biodiversity, which then allowed for a higher level of intelligence to play out. We can even see this in a single petri dish today. As we allow life to emerge in diversity and complexity in a petri dish, the whole system can start to do something that we call quorum sensing. Quorum sensing is this phenomenon in which suddenly a hyperintelligence is expressed by the population. Each bacterium does not seem to have a consciousness to it. It doesn't seem to have an intention or a purpose. But you put that into community, and bizarrely, you start to see this intention for something greater than self to occur. There's a co-creative process in a field of bacteria that can imagine fungi, that can imagine multicellular life. Whether that's a literal imagination such that our human brains could wrap some sort of meaning to that word imagination, or if it's just a collective potential of life, I'm not sure. But I do find it fascinating that we see this hyper-intelligent state, this hyper-consciousness seem to emerge from diverse and teeming populations of bacteria. As the fungi emerged, we see a real perfecting of this process of communication. The mycelium are this master network that runs through all of the soil systems of the planet. Sort of like tiny little root fibers, the mycelium are this fiber optic system that moves light and energy across great distances in a farm field or in a forest or the like. And the mycelium are capable of not just communicating through these neural pathways that transmit light energy and information down their bodies, they also transit the resources themselves. Imagine the internet that would not only connect you to your grandmother across the country via email or via your Facebook or via your Zoom call, it would also deliver the cookies that grandma wants to give you. That's what the mycelium developed. The fungi, long before our imaginations ever created the internet, had figured out how to communicate over vast distances between species and deliver the nutrients and resources that those species would want to share to create life on Earth. And so for all of the intelligence of your cell phone, we have not yet duplicated the brilliance of life potential and life-giving force and nurture of a field of mycelium lying beneath your feet. Nature, over her billions of years of progress, has discovered that communication and sharing is the literal fabric of life on Earth. For this, we have a lot to learn. We need to start to understand the human body in the context of these cellular systems, and we need to stop seeing them as our pathology, as our problem. And this is where we need to start to emerge from our fear of these tiny little microbes. And that certainly steps in when we start to consider the protozoa and the parasite. The protozoa, as a more complex form of a bacterium, has specialized organelles within it that allow it to increase the amount of energy it extracts from the environment and an increase in the metabolic rate of its relationship to that nature. So it's exchanging information and resources faster and faster with its environment, and allows it to grow much larger than a typical bacteria and develop specialized resources and function within that cell that are much more similar to the multicellular organism of something like a mammal. So the protozoa was really the first step of nature to figure out how to do life at a higher level of vitality within that single cell. The parasite would then become a multicellular organism where you see differentiation happening, and you see legs and eyes emerging from these little parasites. And if you want to really blow your mind or perhaps gross yourself out, you just look up skin microbiome and the parasites. There's these little worm-like guys that live and thrive all over your skin. They clean the pores out as you go through your day. They live underneath your eyelids and maintain a critical ecosystem below there. These parasites are not bad for you. We now know that they are critical to life on the skin, life below the eyelid and the like. And so we need to lose this pathologic belief of these organisms and start to understand that without these, life would not have occurred. Human life could not have occurred without this teeming complexity of the microbiome. As it marched from the archaea to the bacterium to the protozoa, ultimately to the parasite, we see this thriving capacity for life and intelligence. And at each turn, we see this sharing of information and genetics to push towards this higher level of complexity of life. The phenomenon of plant life came right out of the protozoa. And so the ability for a moss or a lichen to occur, and then ultimately for those first ferns, and then the trees, and the evergreen, and then ultimately into the deciduous tree, this higher order of beauty and magnitude perhaps that's emerging from that system is representative of this sharing of resources and this ability to transit resources further distances. And so ultimately life is a cooperative phenomenon, and the microbiome of the human body is ultimate in the demonstration of this. The gut has long been seen as the garden place for the microbiome. And when you just look at sheer volume and complexity, or volume and diversity of biology when it comes to the bacteria, the gut certainly is king. The colon has more complexity there in its biodiversity than any other organ system in the body by a long shot. But the skin follows pretty quickly thereafter, and the first section of the small intestine. And then ultimately we find out in these recent years that if you genetically sequence any organ system in the body, you find bacteria, fungi, yeast, protozoa, and ultimately parasites. And so it is somewhat jaw-dropping in a physician's mind to find out that the human body and its health and vitality is not a sterile environment. It is in fact a teeming and coordinated ecosystem of all of these organisms living within us cooperatively to bring forth ultimately resource sharing and communication that will allow for the vitality of your brain, or the vitality of your liver, or prostate, or kidneys. You go down the list, it's a phenomenal reality of garden systems nurturing life within it. And as we start to see pathology emerge, we can track that back to changes within the soil system. Some extraordinary examples of this are something like the Alzheimer's phenomenon. We now know that in these dementia processes, there's a change in the microbiome that precedes any of the neurologic injuries that would then manifest as dementia. In the same way, breast cancer can be preceded by a change in the microbiome. A breast cancer in the left breast of a woman can be seen to have a dominant species of Mycobacterium radiotolerans. It's a very resilient bacteria. It's tiny little bacterium that looks a lot like the archaea that we've talked about in the adverse ecosystems of acid pools and oceans and the like. This Mycobacterium radiotolerance is adapted for stress environments. It's adapted for acidic environments. And it turns out that long before breast cancer occurs, inflammation and the accumulation of stress at that biochemistry level starts to lead to biologic dysfunction. And the first symptom of that is a loss of the dominant bacteria within the healthy breast, which happens to be Pseudomonas, which sounds like a bad bacteria if you've ever been in a hospital, but there's a critical Pseudomonas species that dwells within the healthy human breast. There's thousands of other species that are in that same healthy breast tissue, but the Pseudomonas seems to be kind of the dominant coordinator of breast health. And preceding by a number of months or even many years to that breast cancer, we see a loss of the Pseudomonas and the emergence of the Mycobacterium radiotolerans. And so what that change in the soil system is showing us is the accumulation of stress and the accumulation of acid and other dysfunctional biochemical and biologic phenomenon that, if not corrected, will lead to the occurrence of isolation of a single cell within that breast, which will then become cancer. And so years before cancer emerges, we can start to understand the microbiome as the harbinger of a problem, but also the solution for the problem. There's many bacteria that can be introduced to a human body to reduce inflammation, to reduce the acidic environment, to detox pathways. There's bacteria that are specialized to remove mercury from environments. There's bacterium that are specifically designed to remove things like your light metals, aluminum, and other things from your brain. It's a phenomenal system of management, detoxification, re-nourishment that happens in the microbial systems of the body. And so I believe that the medicine of the future will start to understand the preventive capacity of monitoring the microbiome in all your organ systems to see a problem long before it creates a life-threatening event. And then we can also understand that the microbiome and its diversity is your pathway back towards the vitality that has been lost as the soil started to fail. By and large, we're finding that your reintroduction to nature is your pathway back towards this vibrant microbiome foundation for the body. The breath you breathe, the soil you touch, the paths that you might walk on barefoot are the environments in which you will communicate, in which you will start to adopt this more resilient and biodiverse ecosystem upon you and within you. There's an extraordinary project that's been afoot for almost 20 years now. It's based in Africa and therefore ironically called the American Gut Project. But the reason it was called the American Gut Project is a gentleman who was actually an anthropologist had a crisis of health in his family. His 1.5-year-old child developed type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune condition where the immune system of the child was destroying cells within the pancreas and its ability to make insulin, and therefore this child was diabetic. So at 1.5 years old, this guy is told that you've got a serious problem here. It's lifelong. Kid's never going to be able to be without insulin. And he asks some simple questions of like, this kid's like a regenerative machine. He trips and falls and skins his knee, and the next day the knee is completely normal. How does he regenerate his knee but can't regenerate his pancreas? And the doctors threw up their hands and said, oh, this is an autoimmune condition. There's nothing you can do about it. It's lifelong, blah, blah, blah. So to his credit, Jeff Leach started the American Gut Project and now is joined by 6 universities over the last 20 years that have thrown a lot of resources and expertise into this project. But it's called the American Gut Project with the understanding that the American westernized gut was failing in its biodiversity and complexity. And the studies now are broadly going in Africa because it's one of the last places on earth that you can find an indigenous gut, an indigenous microbiome. What does it look like when people are still eating the foods and interacting with the environments that have allowed them to occur for 40,000 years? The hunter-gatherers throughout much of West Africa that are still intact are demonstrating to us the power of the environment to code for the gut, and vice versa. One of the dominant species that you find in these hunter-gatherer tribes has only been found out in nature on the hides of zebra. They eat zebra only a couple times a year when the herds are moving and there's a proliferation of vitality within the herds. And so they'll go out many days hunting for zebra, and using archery they'll take down a zebra, and a few of them will quarter that animal and carry them back on their shoulders many days back to the tribe. In that transit time with that zebra hide on their back, they become zebra. They literally adopt the microbiome of that zebra hide. And so by the time the meat gets back to the tribe, they're carrying the information of the microbes that made this animal healthy and vital. As soon as they get back to camp, the tribe has a wonderful affection to it. And kids are climbing all over the hunters that have returned. There's exchange of skin flora between the group. And over the next 2 days, they prepare the zebra feast. By the time that tribe is consuming that meat, they have literally adopted the intelligence of nature that allowed that meat to occur. We're finding that the gut of the hunter-gatherer has a dominant skin species of the zebra present within its intestinal lining that helps not only digest some of the meat and other proteins within the thing, also helps inform their immune system and make them resilient against disease. This gut of the hunter-gatherer has some 40,000 species in diversity, many of which haven't been named or mapped yet. But the complexity of that genetics of 40,000 species is really jaw-dropping. You're somewhere around, 1 million genetic sequences versus our mere 20,000 that we have in the human. And so with 1 million different genetic sequences that would code for different proteins and enzymes and everything else, the detox pathways, the metabolic pathways, the bioavailability that's due out of the gut that has that level of diversity in is truly extraordinary. In contrast, the American gut, that westernized gut that is fed by a nutrient deplete, chemically raised agricultural system, is faced with antibiotics from the doctor a couple times a year. All of these systems of insult, from chlorinated water to chlorinated pools. You've got hand sanitizers and soaps and shampoos and cosmetics, and you go down on the list. It's a wonder we live at all because we have so disrupted our capacity for microbiome diversity on our skin and ultimately in our gut. And with this loss of diversity comes the chronic disease epidemics that really went berserk in the 1990s. So why the 1990s? What happened in the 1990s that would completely undermine human biology, such that we would see the emergence of massive epidemics of autoimmune disease, the emergence of celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disease triggered by an element within the wheat molecule there, or the wheat proteins. A phenomenon of autoimmune disease of the thyroid, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, went berserk in the late 1990s. We now have 1 in 4 girls by age 12 with antibodies to their thyroid gland. The explosion of neurologic conditions, from Alzheimer's and Parkinson's in our elderly, all the way to attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorders, autism spectrum disorders, sleep disorders, mood disorders, all of this emerging in epidemic phenomenon by the late 1990s. What occurred in those short few years was a proliferation and magnification of the amount of herbicides, i.e. antibiotics, that we were using in our soil and water systems globally. The advent of genetically modified organisms in our food system allowed for this change to happen. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, was patented in around 1974 and really went big to market in 1976. And yet we didn't see any real remarkable change in health for the next 10, 15 years. But by the mid-'80s, we were starting to see the emergence of obesity and metabolic collapse, a huge explosion in type 2 diabetes related to that obesity and metabolic dysfunction. And alongside of that, the infertility that would come from that insulin resistance of diabetes and prediabetes. That would become polycystic ovarian syndrome, now affecting 1 in 4 girls in Western countries, rendering them infertile. And so with this march of metabolic collapse, we now can map that back to this ever-increasing amount of herbicide, which was disrupting the metabolic function of the microbiome within soils, and ultimately in our gut as we consumed the residues from those herbicides. In the late 1980s, Monsanto and other chemical companies started to recognize the carcinogenic effect of these chemical compounds, and they published that. They showed that with enough Roundup or glyphosate, you could induce cancer changes in cells. But they couldn't imagine at that time in the late 1980s that we would ever be able to apply that much chemical to the environment because it would kill the crops themselves. Because in the late 1980s, we could not imagine that just within a few short years, we would learn to genetically modify wheat, corn, soybeans, legumes of all types, even roses and petunias and everything else, genetically modify them to be able to handle being sprayed directly with this glyphosate toxin. That herbicide, glyphosate, would take off in 1996 as a direct crop treatment. Before that moment, you had to spray the weeds directly and you had to keep the residues very low or else the corn crop would die. With the advent of genetically modified corn and beyond, we suddenly could spray the entire field directly, the food that we were eating, with these chemicals and allow for the food to continue to be delivered. And so genetic modification of our crops led to an explosion of the use of these chemical compounds in our food. And the result was high residues in not just soil systems, but also in water systems, because these are water-soluble toxins. So the water-soluble toxins of glyphosate would get integrated into our freshwater runoff from the farms, would end up in river systems, which would ultimately end up in oceans. The whole time you have evaporation going on, which then allows that glyphosate to be present in the little air you breathe, and ultimately in the clouds that would then come down in rain. That entire hydraulic cycle would become contaminated with this glyphosate chemical. Glyphosate is now the most ubiquitous antibiotic on Earth. It kills bacteria, fungi, protozoa, parasites, It kills the stuff it touches. And in so doing, it has denuded the diversity of life within our soil and water and air systems. In the United States today, for example, 85% of the rain that we see and 85% of the air we breathe is contaminated with Roundup. This extraordinary fact has led to the phenomenon that we are all expressing this chemical within our systems. In some recent clinical trials that we've done in our laboratory, we were measuring the effects of glyphosate on human systems and measuring the ability of bacteria and fungi through their communication network to repair the damage done by this chemical. So we brought in a bunch of people, studied their blood and urine, etc., and we could not find a single person in that entire study that wasn't peeing Roundup. It's a scary thought that we are all walking around eating enough of this chemical herbicide that we are urinating out the residues of these chemicals all day long. And so we are really become steeped in this antimicrobial phenomenon of chemical farming. And as consumers, we need to start to understand what that ramification is for our children and grandchildren and beyond. As we start to see the phenomenon of initial exposure in the 1970s, no real sense of harm, but then suddenly metabolic dysfunction in the 1980s, leading to an extraordinary immune system dysfunction in the 1990s, the autoimmune conditions, etc., and then by the early 2000s, this explosion of cancer. So what we saw over those 3 decades was the cumulative effect of injury to the microbiome that would then manifest in the continuous collapse of these deeper systems of cell biology. In the 1970s, the Carter administration put together a huge project that was called the Year 2000 Project. And the Year 2000 Project hired experts from all types of industry, from economics to agriculture to technology, computer science, and the like. And they wrote a prediction in 1975-76 of what the world would look like in the year 2000 across all of these diverse areas of technology and beyond. And as it turns out, they nailed just about everything. In 1976, they even imagined the internet. They imagined this communication network happening between computers. They imagined artificial intelligence. They imagined the advent of self-driving cars. They imagined so much of what we see around us today. But they completely missed the chronic disease epidemic that would define our greatest vulnerabilities of this last decade. The reason they missed that was because we've never seen such a dysfunctional biology on Earth. We created in the 1990s, through the advent of genetically modified crops and the ubiquitous use of herbicides and the death of the microbiome as a whole, we created a new phenomenon on Earth, which was a failure to thrive. We created the phenomenon of immune dysfunction, metabolic dysfunction, ultimately the dysfunction of cancer, for our disconnect to this vital microbiome system. And so when we start to talk about gut health, we're not talking about a tube that moves food through it. We're talking about a soil system that has the ability to lay foundations of health, not just there in the gut, but in the breast, in the brain, and all of these different organ systems between. We have the ability to regrow these gardens. And Jeff Leach and the team at the American Gut Project have done a beautiful job of demonstrating that if we take a Western consumer and put them out in the bush with a hunter-gatherer tribe, within just 4 weeks, their microbiome starts to mimic that of the indigenous peoples. Within 4 weeks, they can recover the damage of 4 decades of antibiotic phenomena. And so the nature of nature is one of grace. There is such a grace in our capacity for healing that is modeled into the fabric of the universe, to the fabric of this reality of biology that we live within. The grace is that you literally heal faster than you damage. Your systems of repair are so robust. Our ability to change who we are today is so deep, and its roots are down in this microbiome. And so as you imagine a future where we don't march into our own extinction for our rates of infertility, our rates of chronic disease, which are currently mapping to about 80 to 100 years out in the future. We could go extinct in that next 80 to 100 years, or we could regrow our roots into this vast ecosystem of life around us to recode the life within us. We could return to our indigenous roots. We all have indigenous memory at the biological level. We have the genetics that remember how to mobilize nutrients out of wild-caught animals or soil systems that are so dense in nutrients that they pass it on into the ferns and to the sorrel and to the wild mints and everything else that we used to graze for our salads. There is a life out there sitting within the seed banks of the soil systems that is ready to return to the world. And we have the genetic memory within ourselves to adopt the biodiversity and the biodiverse function within us to see that grace emerge again. For the decimation of human health and life that we've seen over the last 4 decades, we could accelerate the explosion of new life, new vitality within us as we grow these new roots into the microbiome. The archaea, the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, and ultimately the parasites. This is the vitality of life within us. This is where we are going as a humanity, is to either humble ourselves, to understand ourselves within the context of 1 million genes within that diversity of life within us, or we set up the fences and try to sterilize the human environment and depend on just the mere 20,000 human genes that was passed to you through your mother and father. You are a blip on the genetic radar of possibility of life on Earth, 20,000 genes. A fruit fly has 13,000 genes. A flea has 30,000 genes. You sit midway between a flea and a fruit fly in genetic diversity. But if we add in your microbiome, you have over 1 million different genetic possibilities of detoxification, nutrient delivery, vital repair, and the systems beyond. You are the microbiome, and the microbiome has allowed you to occur. And so I want you to start to dig into the possibility of what does life look like without antibiotics. And to say without antibiotics, that's far from not taking an antibiotic for your sinusitis. It has to do with not eating food that's been contaminated with glyphosate. Start to urge vast changes in our agricultural legislation and the incentivization that has monetarily benefited farmers to choose these chemical pathways of agriculture, to change these systems to allow us to start to adopt nature and its understanding of its rights and its sovereignty within human life, within human social and political systems. We need to reimagine it, because if we don't, we die, we disappear. And perhaps that will be good for the planet. We certainly know that the planet will recover from this extinction as well. And perhaps we just aren't going to quite reach that level of consciousness that would allow us to stay and play. But there's something deep within me that believes that we are about to go through a massive phase shift as a human consciousness. We could do quorum sensing. We could reach this hyperintelligence where we suddenly realize, oh my God, it's not just everyone out for themselves. It's not one human against the microbes. It's not one human against the cancer. It's not one human against the anti-human. It's literally life participating in a cooperative fashion towards this phenomenon of quorum sensing. What is the hyperintelligence that we are capable of when we see ourselves as one whole, when we see ourselves as one imagination? What is the future we will create? I get so curious about that, and there's a spark of joy within me that wakes me up in the morning, that gets me out of bed, that says, hell yeah, I'm in. I'm so curious of what's going to happen today, because it's not the pain and suffering I see in the clinic. It's not the pain and suffering I see on the news. It's not the war and the anti-this and the anti-that and the pro-that. There's something much more beautiful about to emerge from our collective consciousness if we can take that pause and listen in to what nature is trying to tell us. In a bizarre way, the microbiome is singing to us right now, and she's got a message of hope, a message of grace. You are here on purpose to become part of a global civilization that is beyond human. We are ready to emerge with our hyperconsciousness, with our quorum sensing. To get there, we're going to have you realize how important you are in the matrix, how important you are in this incredible symphony of life. Because without your mind, without your perspective, without your life journey, we would lack some element of the biodiversity of the human species, of the human narrative. You and your journey is a huge part of who we are. And so share your story of human life with each other. And for that sharing, we can rewrite a new narrative, a new story of where we are headed. And it will be definitely a future that embraces the beauty of the microbiome. If Pseudomonas didn't know how important it was in the ecosystem, and it saw itself as inferior, and it just stopped using resources, stopped proliferating, stopped caring for its offspring, we would see the collapse of breast health and breast cancer all over the place. In the human, Pseudomonas, a little bacterium, understanding its role in an ecosystem, its vital representation within that ecosystem, would allow for life to occur. Do not downplay the importance of you. I celebrate the uniqueness of you and your role within this greater whole. It is with some great relief that I know that you have never woken up once to think that you are Zach, nor have I ever woken up to think that I am you. Because we have something within us that keeps us tuned to this sense of self-identity. And in that tuning, we become part of this vital symphony, that in our coordination, cooperation, and appreciation, our capacity to listen to those other instruments within the orchestra, we will come up with this coordinated sound. We will harmonize, perhaps for the first time in human history. We will harmonize not just with each other, but with life inside of us, the microbiome around us. And we will become part of this whole life system that will allow for adaptation and healing to happen on this planet. So let's dig in. Let's find our roots. Let's redefine our soils. And let's go enjoy a meal together.